we are, Civic St. Dev with Johnny and Josh, my co-host. Today we are tackling the slippery term of postmodernism because it seems to actually be a useful way of describing this post-truth society we're living in now. So don't close out of this. We're not going to just hit you with a bunch of definitions, but essentially, right, what we're going to be talking about today is postmodernism, which is a way that philosophers, historians, other people have tried to describe this effort in the last couple decades of rejecting grand narratives, right? So if you're thinking historically, this means you're moving away from, the great man history, or you're moving away from a triumphalist narrative or a progressive narrative of history, and you're breaking it down. I was just saying to Josh, right? Postmodernism is inherently kind of this contrarian impulse, right? Like the to break down the assumed truths or the assumed narratives that help explain the world around us, which I know is kind of intangible, but we're going to get into how this actually applies to politics and the world today in just a minute. Josh, you're the postmodern guy around here. Is that a fair definition or a working definition that we're going to maybe expand on as we keep going?
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. I think there's two things I'll say to start. One is that I don't know if too many people out there consider themselves to be postmodernists in the same way someone might say I'm a Marxist or I'm a capitalist. It's more of a state of being or a condition of society that people are remarking on, and philosophers and cultural critics and architects and so forth. So, I think that's an important qualifier that, there's a certain ambiguity to what it even means. And the other point I'll make is that changes depending on the context in which you're discussing it. If you're talking about architecture, it means one thing. If you're talking about kind of art in general, it means something. If you're talking about discourse, whether historically or politically, it's going to mean something else. So I think a helpful place to start actually is with architecture because it is tangible. It's something we can see.
Sure.
And hopefully that'll add give some concrete evidence to what we mean by this term. Let me just attempt to share my screen. And this may or may not be like the 18th time we've tried to figure this out. So fingers crossed. Does everyone see falling water?
I see falling water.
Okay. All right. Thank the heavens. All right. So one way to begin to wrap our minds around postmodernism is just to acknowledge that it is this thing that exists within time in a specific moment within time in the late 20th century. So, it's postmodernism. So we're talking about modernism here as an architectural style that really crops up in the early 20th century. And modernism is a reaction against the historic eclecticism and kind of the very ostentatious decoration and ornamentation of buildings in the mid to late 19th century. Think about like a Gothic cathedral from the Middle Ages and how just ornamented that is with statues and sculptures and decoration. Modernism is a rejection of that. So you see here Falling Water by Frank Lloyd Wright. If anyone's from Pennsylvania or Ohio, you probably recognize this. But you see a lot of the core tenets of what modernism is. Sleek design, simplistic, very functional. You see these clean geometric lines. You see the ribbon windows kind of in the middle of those two concrete blocks, which create an open space, a lot of light and air coming into the design. And it's very functional. That's the crux here. The idiom form follows function. That's a modernist idiom. The idea that the function of a building should dictate the way it looks, the way it's designed. So that's great. People love modernist architecture, but with it came a sort of elitism, a sort of belief that, oh, if it's not modernist, it's somehow less. And so what we begin to see in the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s is a rejection of that. Um, so this is a building by Robert Venturi. It's called the Vanna House. It's kind of in the Philly area, and it's made for his mother. And what you see here is a kind of explicit rejection of the function of the building.
Hmm.
So without getting into all the details, basically what you have is a very simple triangular gabled roof, which is a very functional part of like any home, or most homes. And what you see right in the middle of it is a break in the gable. So there's actually no function to that gable roof line. It's just made to look like a gable roof, but then reject its function.
Interesting.
So one of the ways to describe postmodern architecture is to say it's a rejection of modernism. Another core tenet of it is, uh, what you said in an earlier recording was a kind of a mess.
Yeah.
And that's definitely a good way of putting it. And that messiness is intentional. There's a
Yeah.
certain playfulness or irreverence to a lot of postmodern architecture and kind of rejecting what we traditionally think to be the proper way to build something.
Iconoclastic, I would say, right? Like,
Yes.
um, just contrarian to be contrarian, even, right? Playful, as you
Yes.
said.
Yeah, and so this is a very highly esteemed building. It's by Frank Gehry, who I'm sure many people have heard of. It's the Walt Disney Concert Hall in downtown LA. But it is very much made with a specific rejection of how things are traditionally understood to be done. Um, and one final thing to say about postmodern architecture, and this is where Las Vegas really looms large, is there's a return of symbolism. There's a return to kind of historic eclecticism, kind of historic motifs, and really, in my mind, there's no place probably in the American built environment that more greatly crystallizes this than the Las Vegas Strip. Um, Back in the 70s, Robert Venturi and his soon to be wife, Denise Scott Brown, and Scott Eisenhower go out. They take a group of Yale students out to Las Vegas and they put together a study of what they saw as kind of this emergent, kind of crass commercial architecture on the Strip. And they begin to define postmodern architecture coming out of that study. And we see it here. This is, you have a medieval castle, you have an Egyptian pyramid, you have a simulation of the Eiffel Tower, um, you have the New
All
York City
hodgepodge
skyline.
thrown together.
Right. It's very much a culture of pastiche, as Frederick Jameson says. Right.
Okay.
So, and Vegas is important both because it's kind of a great example of postmodern architecture, but also because, as we know from our favorite character in the story, Trump does have a lot in common with casinos, and certainly his past real estate dealings deal with that. So there's a lot of carryover um, to this idea of like image over substance, right?
Yes, that's what I was going to ask. There's a certain like almost, I don't know, you want to call it hedonism to it, but this like eclectic kind of collector of various garish looking things all in the same person or the same Vegas Strip or whatever, right? Um, is that right? I mean, is that
Yeah,
a
I mean, there's a
fair?
certain it's certainly it's the spectacle, it's the surface level narrative, whether you're talking about a media story or a building. It's the surface of the building. It's the facade that's going to draw people in to Vegas. The thing about Vegas is like all of those buildings have the same core components. They're all resorts. They all have hotel rooms. They all have restaurants, pools, gaming areas. It's the outside that's going to make you decide which one to patronize, right? So it's really more about the outside exterior facade than it is
Yeah.
about the substance inside.
Huh. Yeah, that's interesting. That's really interesting. Um, okay, so architecture. That was a really good little architecture lesson. Uh, how do we get from architecture, modernism, postmodernism, to where this fits into political discourse, where this fits into society, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the basic premise we're operating on today is that the far right under Trump and under MAGA have co-opted postmodern thought and have
Thinking,
co-opted
yeah,
a postmodern way of dictating what they're doing in politics. Um, so that's kind of ironic in a way because they also like to rail against postmodernism. The Jordan Petersons, the Ben Shapiros of the
I was
world.
going to say the intellectuals of the right movement like to rail against postmodernism, and yet they're operating as postmodernists in a way.
Yeah, but still, the basic premise is that there's a certain relative nature to discourse
Mm-hmm.
that we're now grappling with, that the far right has co-opted. I think we think for nefarious purposes. Again, though, postmodernism as an ism, as an academic exercise, is not inherently bad. Like you started out by talking about the grand narratives of historical
Yeah,
study, right?
right.
The idea that Thomas Jefferson is this, one of our greatest presidents. He did all of these wonderful things for American history, and that's true. Like, there's no denying that. He's got a memorial in Washington D.C. Um, no one's disputing that.
Author of the Declaration of Independence.
Exactly. Um, a postmodern critique would say, well, let's look at Thomas Jefferson through the lens of Sally Hemings, right? Through
Yes,
the lens of
right,
his slaves, and
right.
say, well, what kind of person was Jefferson in that regard? And it gets a bit more complicated. It gets a bit messier. And a postmodern
For
analysis would
for
say,
let's put a pin and say for those who don't know Sally Hemings, she's the underage enslaved woman that Jefferson sleeps with after his wife dies, right? And Jefferson famously, never acknowledges this relationship outside of Monticello. But yeah, no, keep going. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I
no, no,
wanted to
no,
make
no.
sure we
Thank you
knew.
for
Yeah,
Yeah, no. But the point we're trying to make is that if you want to really understand Thomas Jefferson, you've got to grapple with the good stuff he did, and you got to grapple with, maybe some of the bad stuff he did, and that's going to create a more accurate and more complicated and more balanced view of the past, right?
yeah. And I'll riff real quick here and say, when I teach survey level history classes, the way I try to pitch it early on in the class is to say we're going to look at the good, the bad, and the ugly of something like American history, right? That is a postmodern statement of how to teach American history, whether I want to admit it or not, right? And the, you know, it's also a reference to a postmodern Western, right? The good, the bad, and the ugly is famously a Western that is morally ambiguous, right? And so that idea that you're grappling with the good stuff along with the bad, um, that's how we do history in a postmodern world, right? The problem is, right, I think, is that this approach to a more balanced, what is truth kind of narrative is that the right has now co opted that moral relativism for its own purposes, right? So if there are no heroes and villains anymore, well, then it doesn't matter how cruel someone like Trump is because every politician's cruel or every politician's corrupt. If Trump lies, it doesn't matter because everyone lies, right? And that's a very kind of nihilistic approach to postmodernism, right? That, well, it doesn't matter because everyone's doing it, or it doesn't matter because everyone's amoral, and that, at least for me, is scary because it seems to remove the guardrails.
Yeah, and it again, like, we have to just make a distinction between, like, a grad school course, sitting around the table talking about Jefferson's legacy versus, like, the governing of civil society.
That's right.
When we're talking about, like, what's true, it's
Yes.
fine to, like, complicate narratives in an academic setting, even in a published text. Like, let's really hash this out. it's not fine to say vaccines cause autism because, well, what's your truth? What's my truth? There are
Let's
real scientific health, civil ramifications to a statement like that, right?
Well, let's even use a historical example, right, that I can think of off the top of my head. Okay, so in a grad seminar in history, we can sit around and critique the shortcomings of the US Constitution, right? We can say, well, it didn't deal with slavery and it led to imbalances in state representation at the national level, and it did this and it did that, and there were financial compromises that came out of it. There were obviously, people had kind of competing interests when they wrote that thing, and they didn't include everyone that they could have included, and all those things. So we can critique the Constitution um, all semester if you want to, right? And yet, at the end of the day, the conclusion to that should not be, okay, so let's rip the thing up and give all power to one man, because clearly the Constitution doesn't work. Um, so you can be critical of something in an academic sense. That doesn't mean you throw the whole thing out and start over with raw power, right? I mean, the vaccine one works fine too. I just think constitutionally, that's a good example of what might get debated in a history class doesn't mean we're anti-constitution in that history class. Just because you can critique something doesn't mean you just then say, well, nothing matters.
Mm-hmm.
Or the Constitution doesn't matter because it has flaws.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah, and I think this, you mentioned nihilism. I think the cynicism, that comes with a lot of modern politics too, where people just want to tune out. Um, that is kind of one of the conditions of this state of society we're in,
Yeah.
where it all seems to be relative. Um, but I think it's worth acknowledging that this is something that the far right has co-opted, and I think that's historically true to the
Mm-hmm.
last 20 or 30 years. One of the phrases that really drives me up the wall that I hear all the time from friends and family is like, well, as you said, both sides are corrupt, both sides lie. All politicians are just in it for themselves. It's like there's some truth to that, certainly, and like any news channel is going to have bias. Um, but no, this is the far right that's kind of seized onto this, um, and it starts. I mean, partially with Fox News being founded in the 1990s. Uh, the Newt Gingrich angle. He's
Yeah.
he's a frequent host, or a frequent guest and analyst on Fox News dating back to the 90s, becomes Speaker of the House. His brand of politics um, really jives with this um, way of
Rush
operating politically.
Rush Limbaugh on the radio would be equivalent uh,
Yes.
material. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So if we're going to talk about origins of it, at least in the political sense, I think Fox News has something to say, but also again, like the role of the left in kind of the introduction of like subjective truths, like the
Yeah.
my truth or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, it might be noble on the surface, but once you introduce this idea that like, well, maybe
Truth
what
is
we were saying,
subjective. Yeah.
yeah, then that can easily become a weapon um, for any number of facts that are then going to be challenged, which we might have said, well, it's of course it's common sense that you know the 2020 election wasn't stolen. Of course, it's common sense that climate change is real. Look at the data, look at the science. But instead, we're now debating basic facts about that. Um,
Because once you call into question the existence of truth, and this is the danger I see of postmodernism as a way of thinking, right? Once you call into question that truth can exist and that we can know what truth is, you open the door to people who don't want to believe the truth, right? You open the door to people who want to tell big and small lies, right? And politically speaking, I think Trump, Vance, people on the right have capitalized on that opening, right? because both sides, as you said, opened that door up and said, well, what is truth, right? Can we know what truth actually is? Once you start, going down that line of thinking, you open the door to this post-truth world that we've entered. I don't know. That's me as a skeptic, I think, of postmodernism saying that. I don't know.
Well, I mean, again, though, it's like no one is really
No one's
advocating for
exactly.
postmodernism. It's just something we're grappling with. And it comes out of this kind of impulse to challenge grand narratives. But, yeah, we just have to, as citizens of a country, we have to be able to navigate the discourse and come down and say with kind of definitive certainty, like, here are the facts on which we're going to have this discussion or this debate. And no one's saying we shouldn't have debates,
Right.
but we got to have debates with a common set of facts. So if we're going to talk about climate change, like 10, 15 years ago, you wouldn't find many Republican politicians out there saying, oh, climate change is a hoax. Most people acknowledged it. And the debate was, well, what is the speed?
Whether it was man-made, yeah.
Well, what is the speed with which we should address this issue? Should we just stop all fossil fuel projects right now, as someone on the left might say, or should we do it more gradually and make sure we're actually keeping in mind the people who are going to lose jobs if we stop, carbon production? That's the debate, and there's a very good debate to have there. The debate wasn't, oh, is climate change even man-made to begin with? Do we need to do anything about this? And that gets into this question of like, well, what does the far right have to benefit and gain from an embrace of kind of this post-truth mentality?
Mm-hmm.
In the case of climate change, it's pretty obvious. It's just follow the money. Where's big oil spending its money politically? And who benefits from saying climate change is a hoax? Well, oil companies do, because they're going to keep drilling. They're going to keep producing. So in that respect, it's pretty straightforward in my mind.
Yeah. Well, and, this is the thing with the lies, right? I think everyone, even supporters of Trump who are listening to this, right? You've got to acknowledge Trump lies. He lies every day. And when you listen to a news conference, you can expect him to throw around falsehoods, right? And now maybe a Trump supporter would say, well, that's just what politicians do. But he does it at such a rate, right, that it's like, I don't think even Trump expects everyone to believe everything Trump's saying, right? So what does that do at some point? I think it numbs a listening audience to what the what it numbs them to what truth actually is. Can you see my screen now?
Yeah.
So this is a quote from Hannah Arendt, who is a thinker that comes out of Europe, having lived under the totalitarian regimes of the mid 20th century, and she had reflected on this idea of like, why do you just keep hurling lies in a society? What political gain do you get out of just lying for lying's sake? And this is in an interview she gives in 1973 after the totalitarian regimes have fallen in Europe. But she's reflecting back on like the loss of the free press, the loss of truth in German society, right? And the moment we no longer have a free press, anything can happen. We haven't gotten there yet in the United States. We still, I think, have some honest journalism going on, but we're headed that direction, right? So what makes it possible for a totalitarian or any other dictatorship to rule is that people are not informed. How can you have an opinion if you are not informed? If everybody always lies to you, the consequence is not that you believe the lies, and here's where we get into Trump, right? I don't think Trump expects everyone to believe his lies, but rather that nobody believes anything any longer. This is because lies, by their very nature, have to be changed, and a lying government has constantly to rewrite its own history, right? And the idea here is that it essentially numbs the population to the point where we don't think anymore, and we don't know what to believe anymore, and we've been flooded. The zone has been flooded sufficiently with untruths so that we don't know what a real statistic is versus some made up statistic that Doge posts on their website, right? And I think that's kind of where we're at now. Is, if Trump says this guy's a gangster, but we have no proof that this guy is in a gang, some people will choose to believe Trump that day. Some people won't choose to believe Trump that day. But eventually we all become numb to the fact that our leaders, whether it's Trump or whoever comes after him, our leaders are lying to us. And we just kind of shrug it off as, well, of course they are, right? And so then what truth can you actually have? What statistics can you actually rely on? And essentially what this does is it undermines expertise at the end of the day.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
that serves, the people in power more than anybody else.
Yeah, and we see kind of a systemic assault on information gathering institutions. We see an assault on just the collection of data. I mean,
Yeah.
certainly we know about the universities being attacked, and we know why ostensibly they're being attacked. But I mean, there was discussion about dismantling the agency that kind of gathered info on the GDP.
Mm-hmm.
There was information, or there was an attempt to kind of hide the NPS visitation numbers from 2024, which were record high. Because if people don't know that the Park Service is like receiving record high visitation, they're not going to care as much if we begin kind of hedging away at like the national park lands to sell off, um, for drilling and so forth. Uh, it kind of gets into this whole thing with COVID. Like, if there are no COVID tests, well, then COVID doesn't really exist,
Doesn't exist. Yeah.
right? So, any institution, any agency, any news outlet that can hold the Trump administration accountable is kind of considered an enemy because of
Yeah.
that. And so then they just get labeled fake news, right? I mean, we've from the first episode, we've thrown out this idea that every accusation coming out of MAGA is a confession.
Yes.
This is the quintessential example of that with fake news. One really easy rubric to navigating the media landscape today is if Trump is calling something fake news, you might want to look into it and see what they're saying, because
There's
there's a
still a
grain
nugget of truth. Yeah.
there's a nugget of truth there. And vice versa. You like, I don't have the number on off the top of my head, but at some point after his first administration, someone went back and counted the number of lies he had told, and it's like tens of thousands.
I've seen
You
this
know,
statistic. Yeah.
and again, we're not saying news outlets aren't biased. We're not saying politicians don't lie, but they don't in a pathological sense in the way Trump does, right? This is how he operates. And I think one of the kind of tragic things about the debate between Biden and Trump, about a year ago now, was that we saw this frail old man who clearly shouldn't have been there in Joe Biden. But even Biden was attempting and failing, but attempting to kind of recollect statistics and data to make his points.
Yeah.
Because that's what an honest politician does. They try to bring facts to support their arguments. And, notwithstanding the fact that Biden couldn't do it and clearly wasn't fit to be on that debate stage, he was trying. And Trump sounds so confident in what he says because he doesn't hold himself accountable in that same respect. He just gets up there and starts making up numbers.
Yeah.
Starts talking about cats and dogs being eaten in Springfield, Ohio.
Right.
And
right. Well, that was
so
that was
doing
JD Vance, right? JD Vance is the one who put that lie out on the national stage mostly. But
right,
I mean,
and then JD Vance got offended when they started fact checking him during his
right.
debate, right?
That's
And
right.
said, "You said there'd be no fact checking." Right. So there's a real benefit in image over substance
Yes.
that you gain when you don't hold yourself accountable to facts and
you gain a clear advantage, right? You gain a clear advantage in the rhetoric of how you campaign, in how you debate, in how you defend yourself, because you don't actually have to hold yourself accountable to the facts, right? And we see this every day if you watch the press secretary briefings, right? There's no need to hold yourself to any kind of factual truth if you can spin the narrative and make the very few reporters that are left in the room look silly, right? And And if you can label everyone else who's not invited back into the room as fake news, there you go. You've undermined expertise. You've undermined truth yet again, right? And this is a perpetual thing. So that, yeah, if we get 2 years into this administration or 4 years into it or whatever, the the there's going to be fewer and fewer tethers to what is truth, and that's a scary age to be in.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, Josh, as I'm thinking about this as someone as a historian, right, who won't live long enough to write the history of this era. I just have the great blessing of having to live through it. But uh, do you think that MAGA will get categorized as kind of the first postmodern political movement, at least in the United States? I mean, I think we could look at other examples, but is
Yeah.
MAGA our first postmodern political party?
It's certainly the most consequential. I mean, I'm trying to think back to the Tea Party and exactly what was going on there. There were elements of that. There was a strain of anti-intellectualism, I think, coming out of like the Sarah
Yeah.
Palin camp.
I feel
But
like that's anti-intellectualism is a handmaid of postmodernism, but it's not quite the same thing,
sure,
right?
yeah, yeah,
Like they had
no,
a certain alternative truth they had in mind. It was different and maybe flawed, right? But someone who saw themselves as a true blue libertarian, I think they would not be postmodern in that same way as what we see now.
no, certainly not to the same extent. And I think you could talk about Bush and the weapons of mass destruction,
Mm-hmm.
falsehood as a precursor. But again, in totality, no, the Bush administration was not kind of post-truth in the same respect
Yeah.
as Trump is. No, I think it is Trump, and I think Trump himself is
A master. Yeah.
he's a master of this condition of society dating back well before his entry into politics. I mean, the guy was a failed businessman who presented himself as a successful businessman on a reality TV show.
Yeah.
That's postmodernism.
Yeah,
Right?
that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
So this is a condition of Trump, I think,
Hmm.
more so than anything else, going back to the 80s and 90s with his
Yeah.
business dealings in kind of the casino landscape.
Right. He's a showman at the end of the day, right? Like you don't sign executive orders and throw pens to the audience as a like that is showmanship. And it's why Trump's been interested in things like WWE wrestling, which is all about, image over substance. It's why he's into the casino glitz, image over substance. It's why he likes the gilded gold of Trump Tower. I think there's a lot of that.
but even a lot of the buildings that have his name on it, he doesn't own.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's a good
he's
point.
concerned with having his name on the side of the
What's the
building
name?
so people think he owns it. And a lot of times he doesn't even own those.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I think one other element of MAGA, which is interesting here, is this kind of recurring question of when the again of Make America Great Again even is. Because we see MAGA's embrace of history and the past as a tool
Mm-hmm.
to make their points. And they harken back to whatever they want on any given day, whether it's the founding fathers, whether it's the Constitution, whether it's the Gilded Age and the prosperity that we had as a country, or the 1950s and the kind of the social order of the 50s. But I mean, do you see a way to have a conversation about kind of use of the past and how it's all relative within this question of like, when is the again in MAGA? Do we even know?
Well, I think that this goes back to what you were saying about the architecture styles, right? This is a pastiche. This is a collection of moments rather than an honest look at the founding era or an honest look at the Gilded Age or an honest look at the 50s. Um, in Trump's mind, right, or I guess in a MAGA mind, you want to cherry pick the glitzy moments from all of these things. And I'm not even sure that someone like Trump, this is me insulting his intelligence, right? But I'm not sure Trump, if I gave him a timeline and said, place these historical events in order from Declaration of Independence, signing of U.S. Constitution, um, Andrew Jackson, Civil War, um, you know, William McKinley, Smoot-Hawley Tariff, World War II, Consensus America. I don't think he could put those in order like I just did, right? Um, and he really is not interested in putting them in order. And I don't think he's really interested in any one of these great American eras in truth, right? He just wants a hero's garden, right? He wants to be able to say like, "Hey, America was great when we signed the Constitution. I don't know what the Declaration of Independence is about, but it was great too. And here's a statue of Humphrey Bogart," right? Like that's what Trump wants, and it's the Vegas Strip of American history, right? Um, and I think that's sadly, I think that's a lot of people's approach to American history, right? I think if you asked a lot of MAGA people, they would say they're great lovers of American history because they're great American patriots, right? And yet, if you asked them what war Doug MacArthur fought in, they might say the Civil War, right? If you ask them um, what the Declaration of Independence is about, Trump might say it's a document about unity, right? And that's not what it's about. And yet, so again, appearance over substance. The substance of American history is this critical, you know, contextualization, getting down into the nitty gritty, good, bad, and ugly of American history. That's not what I think a lot of people like Trump or his followers are into. They want feel good pastiche of American heroes.
Mm-hmm. Which ultimately isn't history. It's kind of
It's
just
not history.
nationalist.
Yeah.
It's nationalist propaganda. That's not what
Well,
the study of history is.
right. It's nationalist symbols. To go back to another thing you said about the architecture, right? It's symbol over substance, and it's curated symbols over substance, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you can fly the "Don't Tread on Me" flag, but don't actually ask what a libertarian from the Revolutionary War would think of a demagogue, because that will put you in some awkward conversations about Trump's power grabs.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't know. I think that's ultimately kind of where we're headed, in that we're spending less and less time on history and more time on just kind of, like we're going to see it, I'm sure, with the parade that's going to coincide with Trump's birthday, right? It's going to be a lot of flag waving without a lot of grappling with actual American truths, and that's not headed anywhere good for democracy or for the study of history.
Well, and it just calls to mind the executive order from, I don't know, a couple months ago now about, quote unquote, restoring truth and history to, restoring truth and sanity to American history, right? I mean, it couldn't be further from the truth, right? Like reporting examples where interpretation at a Civil War battlefield talks about slavery as problematic, and I mean, what are they going to do? Like,
Right.
uh, I mean, like,
Bulldoze the battlefield? I don't know, right? Like, how do you talk about Japanese internment, Trail of Tears, slavery in a positive light? But that's what that executive order calls for us to do. We can't cast American history in a negative light. I think is how it phrases it there, right? So I don't know how you do that. I don't know how any country honestly can do that. If you can't grapple with the bad stuff, you're not grappling with history, right?
yeah, yeah, and there's plenty to say there about memory and kind of the the fighting over narratives. I mean, that's something that
Yeah.
historians deal with on a daily basis, right? Like, the history is
Yes.
written by the victors. Yes, that's true, but also, there's a certain level of good faith work that even the
There are,
victors are supposed to do,
well, and
right?
there are layers of interpretation, right? And that's some later episode we should talk about how historians actually do their work, right? Because a historian doesn't just come up with what happened, right? A historian is challenged by other historians to prove what happened, right? And there are interpretive layers to this thing called historiography, right? That kind of play a role of checks and balances in how we tell the story of the past. And that's not what happens with an executive order or a hero's garden, but that's a separate issue.
Yeah.
Um, so what's the solution? I mean, if we're in this post-truth, postmodern movement or moment, how do we fix it? How do we get ourselves out of the mess we've gotten into, intellectually speaking?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is simple. I think it's education, which they seem to not like in Magaland either. Or certainly MAGA understands the importance of education, right?
Yeah, that's
And
why it's being targeted. Yes.
yeah. But as two guys who were humanities majors in a liberal arts college, uh, in an era where STEM is so valued, and again, like obviously STEM is valuable, but I think we need to see a return to uh, really valuing the humanities for what they are, which is an ability and a venue to teach critical thinking skills at a basic level,
Yeah.
teaching media literacy, teaching like digital awareness of how to navigate the internet, which is, we're still in the wild west of the internet
Yeah.
where we'll probably look back 50, 75 years from now and say, oh my gosh, there was no guardrails on what could be done on the internet. No regulation on these things, and I think we're probably moving towards that slowly, but we need to be able to teach digital awareness and media literacy and critical thinking skills to understand how to grapple with a political and a media landscape in which it's hard to even know what's true and what's a
Yeah.
fact and what's a complete fabrication.
Well, and I would say, if the actions of the last couple months have shown us anything, right, with Doge and Trump targeting things like the National Science Foundation, Health and Human Services, what we've seen is that STEM can't defend itself against these post-truth attacks, right? And that's why, if there was ever a reason for why we need the humanities, I think we've seen it in the most recent months. The humanities give us the tools in which to defend even STEM against post-truth um, nefarious actors that want to do away with science foundations and funding sources and attack institutions like Harvard or Columbia. If you don't have humanitarians there to think critically, to 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 call this out and to question kind of the untruthfulness of all this, then yeah, even the scientists are going to be in trouble. Even the scientists are going to lose funding or have to flee or find alternative places to do their work. And so it takes the humanities in concert with the hard sciences and the business schools and the social sciences to be able to kind of push back against this anti-intellectual right-wing version of postmodernism.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think just on a personal level, it's, I would say, someone's civic duty to call out lies when you hear them.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, it's almost like the analogy I think of is the crazy guy on the side of the street, yelling about the Earth being flat.
Mm.
And it's like, for a lot of my life, you just let that guy keep yelling at the sky, like
You tune him out. Yeah.
no one's taking him seriously. Tune him out, throw a dollar at him to get him. I don't know, but it's like that crazy guy is now kind of front and center in the political landscape.
Got the megaphone.
Yeah, the Earth being flat isn't really that much of a problem when it comes to civil society. But if we're going to start questioning vaccines, if we're going to start questioning election integrity, if we're going to start questioning climate change, these things have real ramifications for
That's right.
the basic functioning of society moving forward. So if you're going to hear someone saying, oh yeah, vaccines and autism, there's a connection there, you just have a civic duty and responsibility to say, well, hold on, where are you hearing that? And certainly there's an appropriate way of going about it, being civil and nice,
Yeah.
as much, which I struggle with, as my family would tell you. Um, but you have to do it. You have to call out the lies,
Yeah.
because sometimes they're nefarious, and then sometimes people just genuinely don't know, because it is so hard to know a lot of times what's true and what's not true. So I think that's the personal role we can all play.
Yeah, well, which leads us right into kind of, I think, as a wrap up, what we're going to look forward to talk about next time, which is about media consumption, right? So thanks for bearing with us for 45 minutes of postmodernism today. But I think that this theme of truth has been an ongoing theme since we really started talking 10 episodes ago, and so we're going to keep talking about it as it relates to media of all forms next time we get together. We're going to talk about how to responsibly consume regular media, legacy media, if you want to call it that, social media, and then kind of alternative forms of media that we see pop up on podcasts and the internet and whatnot. So that's where we're headed next time. So we hope you stay tuned. Thanks for watching again. And Josh, thanks for taking time out. I know it's always a challenge to carve out enough time to do these things. So
Happy Memorial Day, you scumbag.
that's right. Yes, that. Yes. Oh man. All right. Well, with that sign off, we'll call it a day. Thanks.
Alrighty. Yeah. Take care.